Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sense and Signal podcast. I'm one of your co hosts, Daniel Tarker, and I come from the perspective of higher education and leadership and administration, and that's what lens I bring to the table. And I am here with my other co host.
And I'd like to also say that this is our special ASMR edition of Sense and Signal. So I will be also speaking very quietly and distinctly so you can understand every syllable and word I
Well,
say.
you made me paranoid before I hit the record button, Jodah. like, you're like, you should really get some sound buffers. So I'm trying to be like extra quiet.
No, I like this very much. This is yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going for the
Anyways, I
NPR.
yeah, no, this is and also working from the NPR desk is Jodah Jensen. I am a product designer of 20 years, and I will be bringing a sort of a business perspective to our discussion, as informed or uninformed as it might be. So, welcome. How's that?
Welcome. That was good. That was good. I like that. I like that a lot.
Okay, all right, good.
We could do it dual. We could do this podcast for dual purposes. Talk about business and leadership and sense making and ASMR because there is a big. Some of those ASMR YouTubers, they're making some bank.
Yeah, you can go to sleep listening to us talk about sense and signals. I like that idea.
Yeah.
Let's consider. Let's think about this as we move forward. So, but anyways, Dan.
Anyways, we are going to be talking today about remote work, and we're going to be talking about that because of Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell, the famous New York Times best-selling author of Blink and The Tipping Point and many other provocative books. He's notorious for the 10,000 hours rule. If you do enough work, practice 10,000 hours, you'll become super proficient like the Beatles and become rich and famous. Provocative statements like that. We all know Malcolm. We all love Malcolm. But Malcolm
I love
ticked
Malcolm.
off some people.
He did.
He ticked off some people, though.
He did. Not
Why did
uncommon.
he tick off some people?
Well, why did Malcolm Gladwell take off some people? Um, so Malcolm recently was on a podcast, which called Diary of a CEO, which I had never heard of before, and I would like to recommend people to probably take a look at that podcast. I listened to the whole conversation, and I thought the interviewer, I can't remember his name at this moment, did a fantastic job of interviewing Malcolm Gladwell and asked some really good questions. And he's very um, um, what's the word I'm looking for? He shows a vulnerable side to an interviewer, which I kind of thought was really interesting. So definitely check it out, Diary of a CEO. Anyways,
Yeah, it is good, and I do think but I will caveat that I think the CEO interviewer is culpable in part for the controversy.
well, they were definitely aligned. So I'm going to read. So Malcolm and him were talking, and they discuss a bunch of stuff for an hour and a half or 2 hours. But at some point in time, they brought up a conversation around working, about the working collaboratively and together, which then dovetailed into just the notion of the world we live in today where people are working remotely. And Malcolm made some statements, and I will read some quotes here that he said. His quote was, quote, "It's not in your best interest to work at home. I know it's a hassle to come to the office, but if you're just sitting in your pajamas in your bedroom, is that the work life that you want to live?" And I think he also said something important. He goes, "If we don't feel like we're part of something important, what's the point? If it's just a paycheck, then what have you reduced your life to?" Bam, drop the mic. That's what he said. And it seems to have caused some controversy. And before we really go into discussion, I'd like to just kind of give some media feedback. And I'm sure there's some great stuff. But on this Inc. Article that I'm looking at currently, this was sort of these were the bullet points of the Inc. Uh, article. Bullet point one: it makes Gladwell seem horrendously hypocritical. Two: it drips of privilege. Three: Gladwell has a simplistic view of work from home. Four: Gladwell hasn't looked at the data. Um, I have issues with every single point here, but at the same time, I totally understand every single point here. So, anyways, what are you thinking, Dan?
Well, I think I'm always on board with critiquing the media because they deserve lots of critique, and I think I've read that Inc. article as well, and I think it's ripe for critique. Um, if you listen to the audio version compared to how they report on it,
Yeah,
there's a disconnect there, right? He doesn't come off as nefarious in the podcast as he's depicted in the print article. And when you cherry
yeah,
pick something somebody says and then you put the words down in print, you lose a lot of stuff like tonality and physical gestures and stuff like that. So I don't think it's the Inc. article and a lot of the other feedback around his statements by other media outlets. I don't think they fairly depict what he said and how he said it. And th- though I disagree with him, I want to caveat there too. Like I don't necessarily, I'm not on board with Malcolm Gladwell. And actually, I find it interesting. Like the most problematic thing he said isn't getting reported, but we'll get to that later. Um, but yeah, I think the reporting is kind of clickbaity is probably the best way to put it.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, and just to be clear, that we're not going to be focusing on him and people's response to him, but he brings up
No,
some interesting points that, or a point that's around the where people are talking about, but probably as rigorously as they need. It's been 2.5 years since COVID, and we're probably just now seeing the results of that massive experiment that we all jumped on, or many of us jumped on, about 2.5 years ago.
hmm
Um, but putting that aside, um,
and I would not characterize it as jumped on. I would characterize it as we were thrown into it.
we were thrown into
We
it. No,
spiraled into it. Nobody made the choice to work remotely at that point.
or most of us didn't. Yeah, exactly. And but I would say you made a comment that you disagree or don't necessarily agree with this point, and I'm going to actually say that I'm going to be a little more equivocal and say that I do agree, but I think he qualified his statements very recently around what he said. And I think that the distinctions that the article here is making are just not really fair. I mean, he really wasn't necessarily coming from a position that of you're a bad person for wanting to work from home, which is way it's being written here. I mean, he's a writer, and he qualifies that later on in a different interview where he says, yeah, as a writer, yeah, there's no reason, there's no office. That's a solo affair. You don't need it. Or if I was a pianist, I don't. There's no office to be had for me to join. But what he was saying is, in efforts that require collaboration, that there is something to be said about being in the presence of other people in a healthy environment. And again, we'll discuss it more deeply, but I think that it's not that he was taken, it's not that what he said was taken, well, it was taken wrong, but I think it was taken, pulled out of a context, and I can
And
guarantee,
purposefully.
yeah,
I
and
mean,
I
it's
think,
it's clickbait.
yeah, when you say purposely, but intentionally, yeah. And I think his point should be discussed. Like, and I think we're about to do that, if I may say. So,
Yeah. I think there's a
yeah,
lot to discuss. I take his point seriously. I think that I might disagree with him to a degree, but I see there's validity in his point as well. I'm not saying, and I think just so I don't lose the point, I think the most problematic thing he said in that podcast that hasn't been reported on is that those who are resistant to coming back might be forced to because of a recession. Now, that is a little bit of an interesting point that he made that I found that kind of made me go, I probably wouldn't have gone there. But I
yeah,
think his argument that I think there's validity to his argument that when you are at work with with a group of people, a team, That's the word him and the host of the podcast continue to use the term team. When you're part of a team, there's a nice dynamic to that, and there is a different level of maybe a different level of collaboration than what happens, when you're on Zoom. Um, and I guess it all depends on what industry you're in too.
Yeah, yeah. So let me throw out just some statistics. So although COVID, the pandemic, did usher in an unprecedented work from home force in our world. There was some trending going on around that. There were already people who were beginning to work from home, and so it wasn't completely alien to us.
You're
I
saying
actually
before COVID?
before COVID, yeah, there
Yeah, of
were a
course.
decent amount of people that we were beginning. I was never one of them. I was always very jealous. I had some friends who definitely worked from home, and I saw the sort of level of liberation they had around that. Of course, I didn't do it, so I wasn't aware of any of the downsides of it. They never brought them up. Perhaps there weren't any for them, or if they were outweighed by the benefits. But here are some numbers and I got this from a website called Zippia.com, where I think they do some, they say they are a career expert. So from their numbers, in 2021, 26.7% of the U.S. employers worked remotely. Uh, and then there were expected to be 36.2 million American employees working remotely by 2025, and 40% of the workers believe that they've been more productive while working at home during the pandemic as opposed to the office. 6% of the 16% of the U.S. companies are fully remote. I believe this is still all of 2021. I believe, or so. This report was printed on April 5th, 2022. So perhaps that is now. And then a couple other numbers here. 66% of the U.S. employees work remotely at least part time, with up to 92% of employees working at least one day per week remotely. That's a lot. 92% of employees working at
I
least
don't
one.
believe that data. I don't believe
Currently,
that statistic.
68% of Americans would prefer to be fully remote. That means a considerable majority of U.S. workforce wants to work remotely. 50% of employers believe remote work reduces absenteeism,
Oh,
and 16% of companies are fully remote, which I think is kind of which sounds right from the other data that we had. Um, Yeah, and I haven't found any statistics. Actually, I think I did see something around what we were before, and I believe that we had. Let me see. I think I saw it somewhere here where the numbers that we were at before, where I think we had. Let me see here. Is remote increasing? The I believe we were at like 10% of the workforce were working remotely before the pandemic, and we were
yeah.
at our highest level of remote work in the spring of 2020, where working fully remote, 51% were working fully remote in the spring of 2020.
That
Um,
doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
where in the spring of 2020, not working fully remote, were not fully. And when they say not working, so that means some people are partially working fully, were partially remote still at that point in time. So that was our high point. So we are going back a little bit on that. I know people have gone back to the office. I have friends who are currently going back to the office for the ritual, for the camaraderie. It's pretty much a ghost town, so there isn't much camaraderie.
And
Um,
that's something they bring up in that podcast that Gladwell was on, right? That
yes,
they make the point that Gladwell had visited some executive offices to pitch a show in LA, and they normally seat 500 people, and there were like 4 people there.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so there's the question. So if you read the literature, I mean, at least from how I'm translating it, there are a lot of benefits to work from home. Um, and the literature tends to lean towards the benefits towards the worker, and there's nothing wrong with that. There is some stuff I've read around the business, that I've seen around the effects on the business. Like we just saw that one thing where business think that absenteeism is less. I think there's a reason for that, which is probably a little bit cynical on my side. There's also a report from the business that productivity has actually gone up, but there's also some other research that suggests why, and it's not really good news, which we can get into when we start maybe talking about some of the, the
Hmm.
more deleterious sides. Is that the word? Deleterious aspects
Yeah.
of uh, of working remotely. Um, but there people do want to work remote, and like there was this one uh, result from a study by Stack Overflow where they interviewed a bunch of engineers, and they found, and this was 2017, that 53% of the developers on the Stack Overflow surveyed ranked they that they would like that they liked working from home. That they valued that as a benefit. That they would look at that as something as a
Mhm.
reason why to go to a company. And that's one sort of that's one work type of workforce, and one that sits on a computer and programs, and perhaps would be different for someone who has to perhaps engage maybe sales or marketing. I mean, I don't know, but that was done, and there was another researcher who suggests that data might be of a minority, and her name is Mimi Nyung, I believe. How was you pronounce her name?
Hmm.
Nguyen, and she suggests that data is important, but that it's hiding a lot of other information out there, and that from her research, that she's identified that people are feeling less connected at work. That they feel more like a worker than a member of the team. And actually, she used the word member of the family, which is really interesting because I,
Hmm.
over time, have identified work as sort of like a place where I want to have an extended family. And maybe that's very specific to the field and the area I am in. But and that might be pretty the idea of thinking of your work as family might be kind of privilegey. I don't know, I really don't know, but she used that word, that they said they felt like a worker, less like a family member. And they said, and there was one quote, she said one respondent said they don't see how your bosses don't see how early you show up in front of your computer, and they don't see how hard you are working. um, so there's the potential to disconnect. So we're getting signals that people that they're getting more value from their workers. That we're also getting signals that people like being able to be home, be with their kids as they grow up, or with their loved ones. They like being able to at times do deal with life and have that life balance. I guess that's the phrase. I guess there's a life balance story here that people are saying has improved to some degree. Life work balance has improved. Um, but I'm wondering, is there a dark side that's not being fully reported? I don't know.
Well, I mean, every gift also has a theft to it, right? I mean, so there's always benefits and costs to everything that happens, and we just have to figure out, what we're willing to live with and what's in the best interest of the industry that we're working in, or the company, or the organization that we're serving. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I keep going back to, and I talk about this with folks at work, is I keep using the term new equilibrium. I hate the term new normal. It's too, I don't know, but new equilibrium is the kind of term I kind of go back to, and I feel like we have to find what the new balance is. Nobody wants to go back to March 2020. I think that's clear. Where you're doing a 40-hour week, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day in an office environment. Nobody was really enjoying that. And I think that if there's any gift that the pandemic gave us, it's that it gave people an opportunity to work from home and learn to adapt. Because I think if you were to survey people, and I could be wrong, maybe there's some data to disprove me, but I think if you were to uh, look at, if you were to survey people back in 2020 about their feelings about working from home, you might have had a more mixed reaction to it, because I think people were still adapting to it. People are still learning how to do Zoom, um, learning the etiquette, how to engage in a conversation without interrupting people and making and being rude, and so there was this cultural change happening. and that probably around 2021. I know for me, that's when I started to adapt and feel like, okay, I can do this work from home thing. I figured out the technology. I figured out my how I could make this work for myself. I got blue. There's the glasses aspect, right? Like if you're, the blue blocker for the lights because you're on the computer a whole heck of a lot more when you're working from home. Um, but there are, I mean, so I feel like I could say from a personal point of view, if I could have stayed at home and continued to work remotely, I think I would have thrived there. And I do think there was a level of improved productivity. But I guess, how do you measure that, right? How do you measure productivity? I'd be interested in the data and the frameworks for analyzing what is being productive. What's the output? How do you determine if someone's actually more productive at home versus in the workplace? And as we've talked, Joda, I mean, there's the commute issue, saving time, not having to drag yourself to the office, and there's the environmental aspect around that, not putting as much pollution into the air. Um, there's childcare issues. One feature of this conversation I know we're going to touch on is privilege, and because not everybody has the privilege to work from home, um, but for some that do, or even go to school from home and do remote classes, they save money on childcare because they don't have to pay a babysitter. So there's a lot of it's a very complex issue. Um, but I think we're going to probably have to get to that new equilibrium and figure out how this is going to work for people because I don't think people want to go back to March 2020.
Yeah, and I think you delineated like the basically some of the positives, right? So basically, cutting out the long commute, which I think conflates the notion with work, right? I think the commute thing is important, but it does shouldn't necessarily be rolled into the idea of being in the office. I mean, it makes sense why it is because it's
Are you
part of
getting
the
paid for your commute?
process of going. No, you typically are not, right?
Why not?
I,
That's time I'm giving to the company. I have to now travel,
yeah,
which
yeah,
could be for
no,
some people.
sure, sure. I'm just my point being is that the idea of a commute as far as like working or going on your I mean that's actually I mean that's an interesting point, but I think that they're kind of two separate things because you can pull the commute out technically. So I once had a job where I literally walked one block to get to my work, so there was no commute. And so
Yeah, same here.
so and I'm wondering, I just think those two things are different. I mean, they're intrinsically tied by going into work. You have to commute to get there. So before we started working remotely, there was urban planning to try to build structures and systems so people live more closely to their work environments, so the commutes were less, or they were building public transportation that would make things move faster. So there were these other sorts of approaches to fix that problem, but I just think, like I said, they very easily can be tied. But at the same time, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we make them as if they are the same thing, and they're not necessarily. The other positive you pointed out was productivity, and then there is that life work balance. There is also evidence that people save money by not having to go into work because of cutting
Hmm.
the commute out, because of not eating
You
out
don't
for
go out.
lunch.
Yep.
Right, exactly, because of all sorts of things. And then there's this story of better physical and mental well-being. That those are the positives, right? And then some of the negatives are they're sometimes almost a little contrary to the positives. So for a business perspective, from the work perspective, there's less collaboration, fewer opportunities for you to work together as a group, inefficiencies of collaboration results, harder to network. And some of the information was interesting. Like the some of the younger people seem to be affected by this a little more, where the older people seem to be adapting to a little more easily. And one of the thoughts was, and this was sort of corroborated with one person's sort of statement was that they were like, I only am associating with the people of my age and of my peer group. I'm not having any incidental communications with people beyond that peer group. So I'm not able to network. I'm not developing any networking connections where the people who've been working for 20 years, they've already got those networking connections. And so they're built into their processes already. So we could be seeing an issue here where younger people are going to be kind of losing out on some abilities to get promoted, perhaps because of the lack of these connections. Loneliness, that's one. That's a very real one, and something that's never really or very rarely talked about. And people who come into the office tend to, and this kind of lends to that other thing I said. There's a statistic that says people who come to the office tend to get promoted more than those who don't, and which I found very interesting because women with children are a big portion of the people who like to work from home because they have kids. So
Yep.
could we start seeing promotions occurring once again, leaving out women because of this emergent behavior that occurs from this process, right? And all this stuff is fixable and workable. There's no doubt about it. I'm not saying these are just issues, but the thing that I and the thing that's personal to me in these things, the thing that's is in my working career that's personal to me is, and like I said, I think these things are workable and we'll figure something out. What I do think is lost is that personal engagement when you go into the office, which um, I think that it's I've noticed when I hold certain sorts of sessions, working sessions, which I do a lot because of what I do, where people bring people together to collaborate. The value of the online collaboration is just not as rich as it is when you're present. And there's actually a study that shows it's actually true. There was a research done by that Nature posted in their magazine where they took 600 people and split them into pairs. One set of the pairs worked together in the same space, and the other one worked virtually in separate rooms using Zoom. And each pair was given 5 minutes to come up with creative issues for two everyday objects, a frisbee and some bubble wrap. The researchers found that the pairs collaborating through Zoom style video conferencing generated fewer innovative ideas than did those working in the same physical space. And whether it's innovative or not, that's subjective. But the fact they came up with fewer designs is huge because it's quantity. In my experience, quantity matters, and so there there is a growing amount of evidence that suggests that your efficiencies are lost in certain areas. Probably not everywhere, but when it comes to that collaboration, which is why that Malcolm Gladwell statement means something to me because I agree with him that you lose something through that lack of collaboration. And yes, there are going to be people who just never ever like to go into the office. There are people who don't like people, and that's okay. They much prefer just to be by themselves. Or there are people who like people, but they get tired. Introverts, they get exhausted being around people. They got to recharge, and so they don't want to be in the office all the time. It takes work. It's a heft, which is also understandable. Then there are people who love to be around people, get energized by people. They need to be people. A lot of those people are the ones who are probably depressed right now, right? Because they're not getting that engagement that actually empowers them, that fills them with the energy to be productive. And I think we need to think about this stuff rigorously and with intention. Right now, as we always do, it seems to me, we're letting it just sort of like emerge and be damned with those who fall to the wayside, I guess. Um, and I wish we thought a little harder about some of this stuff. We're all part of this experiment right now, and it's an unguided experiment. No one, there's no controls on it, right? It's nothing but variables, and I think we could probably do a little better around that.
Yeah, I think. Well, yeah, and I think that's what Gladwell and that the co-host or the host of that uh, CEO podcast landed on as well. That you know that a lot of people in leadership positions weren't taking a firm enough stand on and communicating why it was important to come back to the office and work together and collaborate and the benefits of that, and that organizational leaders were failing at that, and that they are just kind of going, okay, let's see what happens, and do what you need to do whatever you want. And um, I work in higher ed. I'm starting to see a shift in that perspective. I know some schools are requiring people to come back 5 days a week, and again, I kind of agree with the host of the podcast that we're talking about, because I think at one point he said we're not saying going back to March 2020, because there are problems with that too, but finding a new balance,
Right.
and I'm definitely all for that. I don't want to go back to March 2020. I don't want to. Never going to be an advocate for 5 days a week, 40. I don't even think we need a 40-hour work week, honestly, anymore.
Yeah.
But 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, I'm not gonna be on board with that. But I can see figuring out a schedule for people depending on what their position is and what the nature of your company is, that figuring out for people, if it makes sense that they have some days that they work from home, if that's something they want to do, and some days they work in the office, and figuring out and being a little bit more flexible and dynamic in how you approach that. And it's not just like this hard, rigid, you know very mid 20th century 40 hours a week, 5 days a week in the office. It just doesn't. That's not good for anybody.
No, no. Well, for some people, maybe.
For some, but
Yeah, yeah. No, and I agree. I mean, in my opinion, really doesn't matter here. But yeah, for me, I think some sort of hybrid. Obviously, something in that area would be meaningful. I love I love a great wine, but I don't want to drink it every day, right? So I want other things, a variety. And I think that, with working from home, I enjoy working from home a lot. I do like, one person said, I like the ability to throw some laundry in at lunch. And I like that.
yep.
That helps me out. It helps me out a lot. It takes
Or
stresses.
when you're off at 5, you're off at 5. You don't have that commute to look forward to.
Or if you're off, or if you're not off at 5, but you got work to do, and you stop working at 3 and you go do some stuff for the next 3 hours, and you can come home and finish it from
Yep.
7 to 9, right? You get
And
to
some people work better like that
you
too.
can you yes you can time shift some of your work. You're not, and you don't have those pressures of like being at the desk, and those signals that you have to that that are that that suggest you're doing a hard day's work at work. Those are, yes, all that is super super important. And I love that part, and I love not having to go into drive in that commute on a daily basis. I think I told you, when I used to work at a company in the Bay Area, I had a 50-hour commute each way. And it was brutal. I was 2 hours a day of my life. Now, I was very informed, lots of NPR, so I knew what was going on in the world. But ask me any question.
And
But
that's what they call a California commute,
yeah,
folks.
yeah, California commute. But it sucked my car up. It was brutal. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I was not very happy about that. And so the idea of, I don't want to do that daily, but I do miss the camaraderie of working with my friends. I don't know if other people feel that way, and there's possibly like people who are just entering the workforce now, have never experienced anything else other than this. Maybe they'll
But
maybe never
I
miss it.
do
Maybe,
have a
I don't know.
question about that, though, Joda. I do have a challenging question about
Mm,
that, and that kind of goes back to what you talked about earlier, of the idea of the workplace being like a family. And realistically, how many people, after you leave a position, you work in .com, so you people in your industry jump from organization to organization pretty
mhm.
rapidly,
Yeah,
comparatively. Like, I work in higher ed, where you get hired somewhere, you're there forever
yeah,
until they cart you out on a gurney.
yeah.
Um, so, and I would say even in an organization like mine, where people basically live their entire careers because they get tenure and stuff like that. I don't know if we might say it's like a family, but is it really?
Yes, yes,
And is that a healthy perspective?
yes, yes. For me, it is yes and yes. I mean, it depends on what you mean by that. If it's codependent, then no, like any family. But if it's a healthy family, it's a bunch of friends. I've worked in enough startups. Like I said, now we're getting into what makes a good business and makes a
Yeah.
great company. But which I think is beyond this discussion. but
It is beyond this
let's
discussion.
just
I'm just
assume that it is a very real thing because it is good for certain companies, and that yeah, it is. I mean, at the company I'm at, well, it was bought, but the company I was at, we would get together every Thursday and go down to a bar and drink and have fun and connect. I go paddleboarding with a coworker who just quit. He doesn't work there anymore, but I made a relationship with that person, and now he's a
right.
friend of mine. My boss, as you know, is probably I'm one of her biggest fans. She's an
Oh yeah, she's
insightful
great.
spiritual person who has done nothing but great things for me and helped me out at times, and it's that matters, and I don't know if that connection would have occurred if I hadn't been there, if we hadn't been in the same room, sharing events with each other.
Right.
The result of that nature study, they did suggest why the why the people who were collaborating in separate rooms using Zoom had fewer innovations, and they said that they think that, oh, what was the quote? Proximity better for creativity and experience. As one possible explanation, the researchers found that creativity correlated with the ability to move about and look around at the contents of the room. Pairs that were more creative spent more time looking at their surroundings. The virtual pairs, by contrast, tended to stay fixated on their computer screens, narrowing the focus of their ideas in small rectangle. And that's really important to me because I'm constantly trying to get my coworkers to expand, to kind of think of the sound of one hand clapping, right? Basically, think beyond the scope of their little world. And these screens do nothing but create oftentimes little worlds, right? You're just looking at faces, and also I can't remember the terminology. There's this thing where you get tired of looking at your own face, and that starts to
Hmm.
become exhausting. And then I think I read that if you spend more than 6 hours, I think you alluded to this with your glasses, you spend more than 6 hours on the screen, which we all are now, then you're very, very much prone to depression, you know? Um, and so
Oh yeah, you can get an overload of it for
you get an
sure.
overload. Anyways, I think I digress. My point being is I think
But I would say some of those things I believe could be
they
mitigated,
can be.
right?
I'm
I
not saying they
think if
couldn't
you're
be.
intentional, no, and I know you're not saying that, and I agree. And the research that Nature did, or if they're just citing research,
They are
it
citing
makes
research.
sense to me. Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, there is something about embodiment and movement. Our consciousness is not just contained in our head or trapped in a screen,
Oh, and not only
right?
that, how about all those signals? How about the subtle signals? A
Oh
movement of
yeah,
a hand, a shrug of a shoulder, the
I
body, the movement of a leg. You
I
know,
find myself though getting better at reading that in a virtual
do
environment.
you though? You say you do, but
I
do
do. I
you?
feel like I am.
Or are
I feel like
people, or have people reduced themselves to facial expressions and stopped? Are we like losing our motor responses to communication, our body motor responses, and just transmitting everything with our face? I think
well, I'm
that's
not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that I'm getting better at it. I feel like I am. Like, I think there are practices you can do when you're hosting online meetings by giving people space to kind of report out and say how they're doing and taking time to do an icebreaker and let people build some community. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think there's ways to work around some of the limitations of that we're finding with working in a virtual environment.
yes, yes, and I think that to take that even to the next level, beyond mitigation, I think there's ways to discover where we could thrive working
Hmm.
in an environment that is remote or half remote or fully remote. I think that there'll always be probably something a little lost, but the question is the loss super impactful for the goals of the company and the people? And
Well, again, it goes back to the gain.
you
What's
might
the
be able to,
gain
that's
from
right,
it?
you might be able to mitigate it and create areas of where people can thrive enough so that those losses are, oh, perhaps inconsequential, or at the very least they're not as impactful otherwise,
And
and
I'll give a very concrete example. I mean, I organize a lot of statewide meetings, um, or I'm a part of a lot of statewide meetings, and the virtual environment makes it a lot easier, to have a critical mass of people be able to attend instead of saying, okay, we're gonna meet in this place, this town, this rural town in the middle of Washington State, like Ellensburg. We're all going to show up there on Friday at 2 or 8 a.m., right? There's the expense of it, and then the time and the commute. And then people are like, oh, I got so much other stuff at work I have to get done. I don't want to make that commute. But just having it as a Zoom meeting allows everyone to, be able to attend. And so, in one meeting I was organized, group I helped organize, we had a conversation around that, and they decided let's meet virtually twice this year, and then in spring we'll have it in person. You know,
Yeah, well, I could again, there there's so many varieties of meetings, types of meetings that don't need you to really be there. If you there's a conference of 5,000 people and you're going to be sitting in a seat and you're 20 rows back and someone's talking, do you really need to be there? Yeah, it's cool to be in those conferences, but that's not as important. There's no collaboration, there's no feedback loop, there's nothing. So I could totally, you're basically watching a movie, so why not watch it on a Zoom call?
yeah.
That's totally
And,
easily legit.
and I know we talked about this earlier today, but I think I'm also seeing situations where you're in the boardroom or meeting room, and half the people are in the meeting room in person together, and the other half are online. Um, I think that's going to be part of the future too. I mean, I just don't see how we jettison this flexibility
Oh
we've
no, no, no!
discovered.
I love work. I love the remote capability myself. I think it's amazing. Like I said, I think it's improved my work life dramatically, or I was going to say dramatically, tremendously. Um, but I do think that we're talking about balance, work life balance, and before I feel like our lives leaned towards work, and right now it's leaning towards life, and not to say that's necessarily bad, but I do think that we might come into some issues if we don't correct some things around that. I could be wrong,
No,
and
no, I think, and I agree.
and
I
it
think you
might
have to
not
be
require
thoughtful about
being
it.
in person either. Like we said, it might just be improvements in this software, improvements in digital communications, all sorts of things. There could be all sorts of things. I'm not supposing any
But
solution here necessarily, but I
but
do think
but
there are things
quickly
that are
to
laws. Yeah.
broaden it a little bit, that I do want to make this point too. Like, I think organizational leaders and the communities within organizations who are going to be making these decisions about what it looks like going forward, as far as remote operations versus in person. Um, there are other folks being impacted too, right? We have the small business owners in downtown centers that I work in Seattle, so I'm thinking Amazon and all those restaurants and business owners around the Amazon headquarters, as an example, who are being impacted by the um, the reduced foot traffic,
Mm-hmm.
during lunchtime or
Mm-hmm.
whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or in the morning during the I need to get my espresso.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's that aspect too that needs to be considered. And that's definitely a larger leadership consideration and government consideration too.
I don't know. People are thinking about that necessarily, but I mean, yeah, we're talking about social engineering now. This is a it we've the emergent behavior is this is a certain level of social engineering where, like you said, the local coffee shop, the local food pod, they're gonna have fewer people coming down, and I'm not saying that's neither good nor bad. It's just change,
Yeah.
and we have a tendency to just say, eh, F it. We're just going to change and let the chips land where they will. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes that's your only choice. But I think we could do a better job of it. And I
Well,
think
being aware of it.
of being
Well, because
aware
it
and
could
planning
lead to a
for it.
death spiral, right? I mean,
Well, that's a
in a
slippery
community.
slope, but it
Oh
could definitely
no, I
cause some
mean,
problems. So
I see it at my workplace, right? Like right now, I work at a college that does not have food services, right? And we want students to come back to campus.
they're not going to
But
come to yeah, yeah.
how do you get students to stay on campus or come to campus when you don't even have an espresso bar? You have no, like, zero, like the only food service is vending machines with week old food in them.
Yeah, no,
How
sure. No, absolutely. I mean, there's a critical mass of offerings that will you need to have for people to find it worthwhile for them to be there. And there's a college life uh, um, thing that people come to expect, and if you're not providing that, they'll either go someplace else to another college that is, or just not go to school. Perhaps going back to our previous conversation
Oh
last
yeah,
week.
yeah. I
You know,
think there's a connection there, but I mean, I'm just getting to the point like if taking that example to a downtown center, like oh man, I can work from home or I can go downtown and go to the office, but all the restaurants have closed downtown, or at
yeah.
least in the walking distance to my office. And maybe I'll just work from home. I can
And
make a sandwich up
And
in the
what does that
kitchen.
do? What about the broken window syndrome? What does that do for urban blight? Right? I mean, is that gonna? How
Yeah.
does that affect? Right? Things like that. And now this is beyond the control of any particular organization that's having to deal with this, like you said. But just thinking from a macro level, these are the things we need to think about. Now, bringing it back to the organization, one of the things I like from that podcast, the host also said, which I thought was interesting in his response to Malcolm's perspective, was to how to get people into the office, was to create a sense of meaning. Right? They both were centering around this notion of meaning, bringing people together for a meaningful purpose, and that the idea is that if you're not able to come together in a regular sort of cadence, as a group of people, intermingling with people, accidentally mingling. I mean, you've just lost that entire that whole. I mean, that was one of my things. I was talking to a friend of mine months ago, where I was like, the idea of just accidentally bumping into somebody and learning something about some division in your company, a direction that somebody's going, that might or might not impact you, so that you can make, you wouldn't have heard through normal channels. The way it's done today, every engagement has to be completely intentional. There's no unintentional relationships. I have to go to you. So people who I used to just kind of bump into at work all the time, although I don't have formal needs to talk to them, I bump into them because they're at work. I don't talk to them anymore. I have to like make a point. I have to intentionally go to them. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
and we joked at one point in time that maybe we'd create a button that says "accidentally bump into" button, and that would just make you accidentally. These are the intangibles that I think we might not
No,
miss. We not might cognitively miss, but from a humanistic level, it will affect us negatively. That's my concern.
no, and I agree with you. And the organization I work for, a lot of pre-pandemic, a lot of relationships were built in the hallways, and ideas emerged, passing in the hallways and sharing information. And yeah, you lose that when you're remote. But again, getting back to how do you mitigate that?
Well, that was
um,
it. Real quick, I wanted to say something about that. And there's a mitigation. Of course, we're going to stay in the world. I mean, like I said, and I'm happy about it. We're not going to. Hopefully, we don't ditch any of this technology because it's amazing stuff. You and I
oh
couldn't
yeah.
do. We couldn't do what we're doing right now. We would. We don't live next to each other, so it wouldn't be happening. But, but I did think it was interesting how they said that it's really important for companies to create a sense of purpose. And I'll say this, and I hope I don't get shot for this, but I've noticed more and more the companies tend to not have very clear direction or purpose for existence. They're very vague these days, and it makes it really hard for people to know where they fit into a company. And it was hard enough when you were actually at a company, but at the very least you were around people where you're engaging with, and you could kind of intuit through just casual conversations and encounters with people. But when you're just by yourself remote, it's very alienating and potentially. And I think it was. I think companies. This is what they said, and I agree with them. Companies need to really start putting more effort and establishing a purpose for the people to come together, whether it's virtually or whether it's not virtually. It's in person, that it's super important that they do this. And I think they're kind of suggesting the lack of this is making it easy for people to say it's easy to work from home, and that if it was actually
Or easy to
purpose.
leave, because I think that was also connected to
Well,
that
and there's a
point
term I
too.
heard just recently. It's called quiet quitting. Have you heard of this term? And I think a
Mm-mm.
lot of people do this. It's where you're not quitting, but you just do the very least amount that you can do at your job and get by, because you get lost in the noise of this new virtual universe. And it's like this new phenomena. Everybody's kind of quiet. It's like the work version of ghosting, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or you
Well,
quit.
I mean, Yeah, I mean, and that's happening. And I've definitely, they used an example. Well, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell used an example of hiring an employee remotely, and they lived in a different state, far away, and they never really engaged in the company, ended up leaving. And I've seen that close up as well. That phenomenon. I'm not going to go into details, but I've definitely seen that. But I will say, like, one thing I've
But
tried to do.
I've also seen the opposite, though. I have seen the
Yeah,
opposite.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's not. Yeah, there's a lot of different factors.
Yeah.
But what the point I'm trying to get to though is we've talked about the Cynefin model of sense making before, and I was reading that book,
Yeah.
and I got an idea sometime during the pandemic for these kind of inquiry lounges that I host. Because one of the things I do at my institution is work in training and professional development. And so these inquiry lounges are kind of open spaces where we just kind of have, they're open to the entire community. We announce it to the entire community, and they're lightly facilitated but focused conversations about a topic. It could be anything, like what's facilities up to, what's the library renovation, where's that at right now? Right now, we're talking about enrollment because that's on people's minds. Um, but there's no presentation involved. People can just show up, share ideas, share thoughts, and I think that's one way to help mitigate some of that the loss of the hallway conversation. You have to create spaces very intentionally and not be trying to control them. They're not controlled conversations, and they're a place for we're intentionally allowing for emergence to happen. We want people to come and bring different ideas, and hopefully for things to evolve from those spaces. And those have been very successful, actually.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out is like what I think there are things. I think my thesis and a kind of what you just said sort of um, touches on this, and that my point is that that first off, again, I think that the remote technology, the ability for people to connect asynchronously or synchronously across the world through this kind of technology is amazing, and it's not going anywhere, and I don't want it to go anywhere. I think the idea of life work balance being addressed through the approaches of remote working is also a very good for the human species as we move forward, as we explore what it means to work, what it means to be a laborer, all that stuff. It's part of that conversation. I think it's great. I think that, and I don't think anybody's at fault. I think it's just moved so fast. But I'm just being the canary in the coal mine essentially here at this moment, and that is that I think that there are parts to this transition that are no, I'm not going to say are being ignored. They're being discussed, but that are really big and that we need to figure out somehow. And whether we figure out by the solution as saying, "Hey, actually, you got to get together for these things," or we figure them out through better technology, like or solutions that any right. It's just let's make sure we kind of address these things. I think that the human connection and the magic of being in a place by around people who are walking around and the what is it serendipity of occurrences in a workplace is lost. And can we first does everybody think that's meaningful to bring back? And if so, if not, what are the impact of us not bringing it back? And if we do think it should be brought back, how do we bring it back? And can we do it through software somehow, or is it relegated to in person one way or another? You know, I don't I don't have the answer for that myself, but I think
Yeah,
that's
I
my
have a
thinking.
feeling the future is going to be a mix, and I definitely, I feel like for this particular episode, I've been kind of more on the online, uh, pro online or pro virtual side. But I go in now at my workplace 4 days a week, and I see both sides of it being on in person 4 days a week and working only 1 day remote. Um, in that, yeah, the serendipity of a conversation emerging that would not have normally happened, I've definitely seen that and appreciated that. And I do know the people who are present and on in person do benefit from those interactions and the human interactions. At the same time, I also think when there's only a limited amount of people present, going back to Gladwell's comment about there was only 4 people in the office building in LA,
Yeah.
for those 4 people, it's very demoralizing.
Lonely, lonely experience.
It's a very well, it becomes, especially if they're like a, s- a customer facing service provider
Sure.
and there are no customers,
Yeah.
right? Or there's nobody there in the facility to serve. It, getting back to the meaning's not there if your job is to serve other people and the people aren't there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure.
It becomes very challenging. So, I mean, these are really challenging conversations leaders are going to have. And I don't think there's a simple solution, but I do agree with you that we don't want to lose the technology part and the what we've learned from the pandemic. If there was any good thing to come out of the pandemic, it's that we learned how to work remotely. So we don't want to lose that, but we
No.
also don't want to capitulate to just being remote, and we need to really have a thoughtful conversation about how to move forward.
Yeah, and I think there are forces out there that are suggesting that remote work is to be should be lost, right? Like Elon Musk is absolutely against it, and I agree with you. We don't want to lose it. There's a value to it. There's a there it is it does add it is empowering for us to be as humans. It empowers us to be humans. Going to the office might empower you to be a worker, but staying home and working from home empowers you to be a person. And I think we were
Mm.
leaning too far before as a worker, and we needed to lean the other direction as a person. And maybe it's necessary that we go really far to discover humanity, and maybe we'll discover the whole idea of how we run the world. Business capitalism needs to change anyways. Who knows? Um, but I think it's really cool that you and I solved this problem in this episode.
We
And
always solve our problems, Joda.
yeah, I know. I
We
think it's really
solve
cool.
every problem. We solved higher ed last
Yeah.
time, and
Yep. Yep.
we
Yep.
know about why asking why from the previous episode.
And I'm glad you were taking one side, I was taking the other. So next time on Crossfire, we will be discussing. Oh no, a different show. Uh, well, I had a really good discussion. I appreciate this. I think I was a little long winded. I hope no one gets bored, but
No, you were great. And if you like Joda's long-windedness, make sure to subscribe. There's a little subscribe button if you're watching us on YouTube, or there's a like button. And if you're on another platform, please also follow us and like us on that platform too, so you can hear the latest episodes. So have fun whether you're working in person or remote. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Sense and Signal podcast.
bye.